Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. This season, we're asking how we can dismantle the myths and misinformation that get in the way of achieving peace, because we can't move towards peace if we don't have a clear picture of what's actually happening. Today, we're talking about how and why powerful actors use propaganda. Specifically, we'll see what we can learn from Russia's use of propaganda in its war with Ukraine. I'll be speaking with Daniel Silverman and Jean Cavelier. Daniel Silverman is Assistant Professor of Political Science in the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, CMIST, at Carnegie Mellon University. His research addresses the psychological factors, including the biases and misperceptions that drive violent conflicts, and how they can be mitigated or leveraged to promote peace. He's the author of Seeing is Disbelieving: Why People Believe Misinformation in War and When They Know Better. Jean Cavelier is head of the Eastern Europe and Central Asia desk for the Paris-based organization Reporters Without Borders, often referred to by its French acronym RSF. She contributes to RSF's Propaganda Monitor, the organization's multimedia platform that aims to expose the many faces and tactics behind propaganda worldwide. She previously worked as a journalist, including in Moscow, Russia. Together, we'll look at how Russia hides behind war propaganda. And more broadly, we'll see what we can learn from communities that are least susceptible to this strategy, as well as how we can get smarter about the media we consume. This conversation was recorded on January 30th, 2026. Dan, Jean, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into the substance of this discussion, I wanted to start by asking each of you if you can share an example of war propaganda or disinformation that you've encountered as part of your work. Jean, can I start with you?
Yes, I remember deep fake targeting RSF not a long time ago. It was about Thibaut Brutin, our director. In a crazy deepfake video, Thibaut Brutin asked Trump to come to France, to invade France, and to take President Macron out a gay bar, and told that he will kill himself. It was a very, very strange video, very crazy, just, I think, made up to confuse people.
That would be awful to have that done to you.
That was not the first time, really. We see very strange things.
You know, there was an AI image that is very similar, in a similar spirit, just recently in the U.S. Iranian context, where there was an image on a wall, potentially scrawled by Iranian protesters, that was real, saying something like, "Trump, save us." And then there was an AI-generated replacement of that image saying, "Ayatollah, save us," that was portrayed as if it was scrawled by protesters in Minneapolis on that wall, saying, "Oh, this is in Minneapolis."
Yeah, so thank you for both of those examples. I think they give us a sense of both the seriousness and sometimes the ludicrousness of the type of propaganda that we'll be discussing. To get us started, Dan, can you help us with definitions? How do you define propaganda, and are there differences between misinformation and propaganda? What are the key concepts?
Absolutely. So the way most experts now in my world define misinformation is that it is false information regardless of intentionality. So disinformation is usually defined now as a deliberate deception. And then fake news is deliberately false and meant to look like the news. So I tend to think of them as these concentric circles of misinfo, disinfo, and fake news. Propaganda, that's a tricky word to define too, but I feel like people treat it as a mixture of truth and spin and misinformation that is often used for state or corporate interests.
All right, so just to repeat, Misinformation, disinformation, and fake news all contain false information. And both disinformation and fake news do it intentionally. Propaganda is a broader category in that it includes a little truth, a little falsehood, spin, and bias. Jean, is there anything you'd like to add?
When we speak about propaganda, there is an intention to misinform the public and to control very strictly the narrative. We are talking about a strategic weapon.
Before we jump into the specific case, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Russia and Ukraine, Dan, I wanted to go back to you. And based on your historical study, why do powerful actors create and distribute propaganda? And specifically, why do they do it during periods of war?
A lot of the propaganda in war, historically, I do think is meant to incite people and mobilize them to sustain their engagement, generate grievances against the enemy and outgroups associated with it. So sometimes it can do other things like hiding things, not incitement, but concealment. And I think we see that prominently in most cases where there are serious war crimes and genocides historically. There have been actors denying them. So this stuff can be used to try to hide misdeeds or underperformance. I think those are two big buckets. There's also a lot of the stuff that Jean gave an example of, sometimes to confuse or troll or so on.
So, across the board, and even the examples that the two of you have given us already, there is propaganda that blurs the truth and is maybe easier to believe. And then there's things that really sound outrageous and unbelievable altogether. In your research, Dan, why do people believe propaganda? Like, what do we know about why people go along with outrageously ridiculous and falsifiable stories?
Right. Well, there are different big answers to that question. And one of them is that we tend to want to believe. We sometimes even delude ourselves with little information or the slightest push. A couple other reasons. One is that we're often lazy thinkers, and our attention and our beliefs can be hijacked in a whole variety of ways. But it's not that we're stubbornly, defiantly defending our beliefs, but that, we fall for certain tricks. And a third one is it's more about our information environment and the media and the way that can be weaponized in conflicts.
The goal is not always to convince people for one story, but to flood the space with so many competing narratives that nothing feels trustworthy anymore. And that is the most dangerous thing.
So, continuing with that, I want to talk more about RSF's research. What's happening to journalists in Russia's war in Ukraine?
The first thing to understand is that Russia is a country where independent journalism has been dismantled for years. The report shows that the Kremlin does not treat information as a space for debate or pluralism, but as a battlefield, really. And you cannot build peace on manipulated narratives. That's why it's very important. We need reliable and independent and free information. It's one of the most dangerous countries for press freedom around the world. And journalism has been essentially criminalized in Russia. Today, we have almost 50 journalists behind bars, and 26 are Ukrainian journalists. So Russia is a leading country detaining foreign journalists. Since the full-scale invasion, more than 1,500 journalists have been forced into exile. So propaganda is not just something Russia exports. It is built first through the destruction of journalism at home.
Dan, going back to you, what are some of the other purposes of propaganda? If you know this conflict in particular or others, what else does it do in this context?
Well, I think we have to start with the reality on the ground. I mean, there's a relationship between the realities that are unfolding in a given conflict and what the actors want to have in the information environment and don't want. Russia has a tremendous amount to hide in this conflict. They not only have a great deal of brutality to hide, brutality towards Ukrainian civilian population, brutality towards their own soldiers, the ethnic minorities they've dragooned into their war machine, towards a harsh environment in Russia itself. So at the same time, they've also very massively underperformed. So they don't want the information out about that. Now, I think Putin's and the Kremlin's biggest worry is that information and what it can do within Russia and certain constituencies within Russia. So you're trying to hide all these facts of war about the tremendous costs of war and the behavior of your side from your own populace, which could be politically contentious. Russia had serious protests early on in the war, and they moved from a quasi-dictatorship towards a brute force dictatorship in the last couple of years.
Jean, has Russia directly targeted journalists with violence?
One particularly alarming investigation by RSF with the Ukrainian human rights organization Truth Owns shows a pattern of Russian strikes against hotels known to host journalists near the front line. So out of 31 attacks, we documented that almost all targeted civilian hotels where journalists used to stay for their report when they covered the front line. So the impact is very direct. Many journalists fear to stay there and they no longer report in this area. So it's reducing independent coverage, and it's the aim of the Russian authorities. One more point about the death of journalists, because often we've seen that after such strikes or after drone strikes, as we've seen with the French photojournalist Anthony Lalican recently, the Russian propaganda channels, Telegram channels or websites, they depict journalists as mercenaries or as propagandists. They try to discredit the journalist. They spread false accusations to justify the strike, and they try to blur the line between the civilians and the combatants. And this narrative, what we see, is intensifying, especially with intensification of the FPV drone attacks.
And what are FPV drones?
FPV drones is a drone where the soldier can see the target directly. This is both physical and narrative warfare, all combined.
Yeah, and for my work in genocide, which is where my research previously has been, there's a common technique kind of where you accuse the other side of doing exactly what you're doing. And I also wanted to note, I saw in RSF's research that one of the most common charges against journalists is that they're promoting false information. Whereas what you've told us is that actually it's the Russian state that is hampering the ability of journalists to cover real information, and they are themselves producing and disseminating a lot of false information.
Yeah, they even built a global fact-checking network, which is a kind of propagandist copy of the international fact-checking network, and which say that the Western outlets are spreading propaganda without any basis, without any real facts in their articles.
And Dan, I want to turn to you and to your research. So thus far, we've been talking about AI, we've been talking about the spread of propaganda, what it does, but your work has also looked at where propaganda fails. And so I wonder if you could set up for our audience a little bit about what do we know about who is more or less likely to believe propaganda?
Right. So all of these grave threats to the collection and transmission of the truth and conflicts are very real and may be getting worse. And I was going to add to Jean what she was saying by noting that the killing of journalists over time has grown tremendously. But it's true that it doesn't always work. Not all audiences buy it. And there's some powerful variation there. Specifically, one of the main arguments in my book is showing how more frontline communities that are really living war and not watching it on television tend to have much greater access to what's going on and have a much different incentive to understand the threats and the dynamics around them than maybe we do, or the keyboard warriors thousands of miles away do. So my book on this is actually titled Seeing is Disbelieving for that reason. And I think we can see those dynamics pretty strongly with some Ukrainian populations that are living through what's going on, and even some Russian border populations and soldiers and just war reporters are certainly seeing things firsthand. Some of the propaganda top down that's coming in and that may be removed. So this I think is a big gap. And there's some reason to think that there's people who really know what's going on and are hard to fool, and a big challenge is getting that out there.
So in the book, what cases do you look at in that research, and how did that frontline information matter? Like, were people who were direct witnesses who could just pierce the propaganda narratives, were they able to make a difference in broader understanding about what was happening in war?
Well, that's going to vary, right? They're definitely going to be under duress, and the states and other actors want to clamp down on those stories getting out, but sometimes they do. So one key case that I studied that got me first into this was the U.S. drone campaign in Pakistan that started in the mid-2000s. And there's a lot we could say about that. There's a variety of critiques we could make, moral and strategic, of the program. But it's also true that you would hear very different narratives from the populations that live in the Pakistani Fatah tribal regions on the Afghan border under drones, and the diasporas that are connected to them in the West, versus than you would hear in Lahore, let's say. So from a factual standpoint, you hear very different narratives from the local population, which largely viewed it as pretty targeted attacks against the Pakistani Taliban and Afghan militants in the tribal regions of Pakistan, and starkly contrasted it with the very indiscriminate violence by the Pakistani army, which used heavy bombing and flattened a lot of their villages, or what they experienced from the Pakistani Taliban. So a different factual picture from those directly getting it. That's a case where, did it get out? It got out to some of us, but did it really drive politics at that time? Probably a limited way.
Yeah, and to add to that, what we see in Ukraine is that the drones are targeting especially journalists and civilians. So that's true. With the drone, you can be very precise. And in the occupied territory or near the front line in Ukraine, they are targeting civilians and especially journalists.
Right. Not meant as a general defense of all drone warfare. I think the story for example, in Yemen by the U.S., it was very different. It does show how narratives about certain technologies, narratives about certain actors can not match up with the messy reality you'll actually hear from factual reporting or experienced populations on the ground. And now I think where we get to is that there's this huge phenomenon, increasing phenomenon, of civilian populations under bombardment or in the front lines of war witnessing and sharing what's happening to them themselves. And a set of actors trying to amplify that. We could talk in Russia, Ukraine, like Bellingcat, maybe like RSF as well. So there is a greater ability for some of these populations that know their own victimization to tell their story to big international audiences. And I think that's been an important phenomenon that makes what happens to them and what they know about it a little more relevant.
Right. And Bellingcat is an independent investigative collective. So with some help, it's possible for firsthand eyewitness voices to pierce through propaganda. Jean, have you seen that in the war with Russia and Ukraine?
Sure. In fact, among the 26 Ukrainian journalists imprisoned by the Russian forces, you have bloggers. For instance, in Melitopol, they were doing some reports, so real testimonies in the front line directly in the occupied territory. They depicted the reality of what they lived and the reality of what they saw. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I know Russian families, for instance, you have the son in exile, the mother in Russia, and the uncle in Ukraine, and they don't believe the same thing. Despite the fact they can talk to each other, I know someone from Mariupol who told his sister in Russia what happened. And she answered to him, no, 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 it's not true. It's not the Russian forces that are bombing Mariupol. It's the Ukrainian ones. They are Ukrainian terrorists. So they couldn't talk about these things because one saw the bombings and felt this in his body. And the sister, I mean, she was watching the television full of propaganda and she couldn't believe her own country attacking Ukraine.
Right. And we should clarify that Mariupol is a city in Ukraine that Russia attacked in 2022, committing widespread and systematic violence against civilians. It continues to occupy the city. So, this example shows how strongly propaganda changes what people are willing to believe. One question for both of you. We've alluded to it, but I'm curious from your perspectives. How much is AI changing the impact of propaganda? Jean, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's a massive change because it has enabled Russian propagandists to scale up their campaigns dramatically. We've seen deepfake videos, fake audio recording, automated fake news sites, even synthetic social media personas. And the goal is not always to convince people, but to flood the space with many narratives that nobody can trust anymore. This is a strategy of confusion. When people no longer know what is true, what is not true, they stop resisting.
Yeah. Dan, what about you?
I think that's very well put. I mean, I think from my vantage point, I saw some experts and felt myself that there was some premature alarmism about AI changing and just dominating the information space a couple of years ago because it was often very easily detectable. It's some of the most detectable misinformation. Say, aha, you did an AI video, and there's BBC Verify and all sorts of other dedicated units that have all the best practice for detecting that. But I do think it's gotten a lot better. The threat's much more real, and like Sean says, I mean, you have to think about their side of it. Sometimes you have to red team this and think about if you're the propagandist, if you're part of the propagandist army, what's their production function? They used to have a very labor intensive, hundreds of thousands of troll armies, troll farms, they're called in Russia, or in many states have what they call electronic armies. But if now the image generation issue, and then you could have either your troll armies putting out more content more quickly, or maybe even automate some of that. Who knows how teched up some of these places are? Maybe China can do that. And then you can increase the scale, if even if it's low quality, maybe sow doubt, like Jean is saying. And so I think it's on the supply side that you could have problems.
Yeah, and in fact, to fight against this kind of massive propaganda, we've seen that fact checking is not enough, even if it's a mean to fight this propaganda, but it's not enough at all. So what we've done with RSF, we have several projects to fight against propaganda. One of them is the Journalism Trust Initiative. It's a kind of label, like an ISO norm, but it aims to be an international standard for promoting trustworthy journalism. It doesn't labelize the content itself, but it's like an ISO for products. So the way you are transparent about your media, who is the owner and so on, the way you are making news, you are checking news, how do you do when you make a mistake, and so on.
So, for listeners who don't know, what is an ISO norm?
Yes, so ISO norm, it's an international norm for every object you have. I mean, a cup or anything that the producer has to comply with. So it's rules you have to comply with to show the quality of a product. And so we try to do the same with the process of newsmaking. And all these questions were set up by expert groups from very different countries, including media outlets like AFP, French presidency in France, and many others. And when an outlet wants to be labelized, they have to pass an audit with an external auditor, like Deloitte, for instance.
So to get that whole chain, the whole way through, who owns it, how it's being produced, and then also owning mistakes. Yeah, I think that sounds very helpful.
There are different products and different interventions in this space, and people shouldn't feel like they have no options in that. I mentioned BBC Verify is excellent, but there's a whole set of great fact checkers, Bellingcat and OSINT, open source intelligence organizations. The other thing is there are some apps you can try to use and plugins you can use as you browse social media. One is from a group called NewsGuard that creates information quality and reliability ratings for, I think, mostly US sources. And, none of these should be perfect to be relied upon. They may have their critiques, but I don't want people to feel too nihilistic, and there's nothing good out there, even as we face a very fragmented and muddied information environment overall.
And I think, Dan and Jean, one of the things too that people need to pay attention to is you're not talking about the analytical component or the making sense of facts, right? Which is still something that people can do. And there's a lot of room for wiggle room there. You're talking about, as you said in the beginning, Dan, verifiable events, right? We're talking about propaganda, misinformation, disinformation as putting out information that is falsifiable, right? You can say yes or no, this happened. How people make sense of it might be an entirely different issue.
100%. I try to be very judicious about that. And I preach and teach that in all my courses. We need to, okay, what is the claim? Is it a factual claim? There's a lot of informational bads out there. There's hate speech and toxicity. And we just discussed in my class, like a claim that a country deserves a territory. And that might be Morocco and Algeria over Western Sahara. It might be the U.S. claiming Greenland. Explosive claim, even if many of us view it as problematic, is a claim about deservingness and what should happen, what ought to be. And it's not a claim about a factual, verifiable claim.
So they're imperial, arrogant, and obnoxious, but not factually wrong. They're an expression of intent.
Correct. There's all sorts of horrible things in our information environment, from hate speech saying, I hate group X. But that's not a factual claim. It's often buttressed by all the members of Group X are type Y. But as far as the misinfo research and evidence goes, there's been an increasing push, I think, to be clear about what that is.
Yeah. As a final question, I wanted to return to what Dan was talking about, and Jean, you were as well, about what can be done. And so I wanted to ask each of you to think about the next year, right? So a near-term change, a near-term timeline. What is one thing that you would like to see happen that you think would decrease the impact of propaganda about wars? Dan, what's your one big change?
Oh, boy. Now we're forced to provide some optimism. On the one hand, right, there's information environment stuff. How can we encourage more supply, protect the supply of quality news we have, stand up for it, defending it, labeling it? Another one is, sort of our own selves, right? And there's certainly a lot of push, some in Europe, Eastern European countries, places like Latvia and Estonia, to have early education for people to build information literacy and critical thinking skills. Try to do that in as much of a process way as possible that's going to be not polluted by all the political antagonistic implications thereof. So kind of empowering people individually versus changing the information environment broadly are two big categories to think about.
So, Jean, what would you do? And yeah, please, you can answer this in the context of Russia, Ukraine, or any other context.
One thing I would like to happen is social network like Facebook or Instagram and others, which have a huge impact because they distribute disinformation and they multiply the impact of disinformation. I would like them to use the norm like the Journalism Trust Initiative or NewsGuard to reward the real journalism, to reward the trustworthy information. And it will have an impact. It will change our perception of the world.
So, Jean, how is it possible to not only make verifiable information visually distinctive, right? So very clear on social media, but also perhaps to change algorithms so that that verified information would get amplified instead of false information?
Yeah, exactly. So they could really easily include our Journalism Trust Initiative label into their algorithm or NewsGuard or others, so that reliable news could be rewarded in this social media and could be distributed.
Jean, are you seeing any pickup of that idea in Europe or elsewhere?
In fact, in Europe, it's already in the EMFA, the European Media Freedom Act. The Journalism Trust Initiative label is already there in the text. The problem is that it's not really implemented by the states right now. So we hope that Europe will be in the front line to impose this labeling against disinformation to the platforms.
Dan, do we have anything like that coming in the U.S.?
I would pick up on that to say that these are great ideas. But, there's high politics involved in all this, right? Platforms are political actors, as are the states. Now, that doesn't mean they're not sensitive to any pressure. First of all, the platforms have retrenched the major leading platforms like X and Facebook, what they'll do, but they don't do nothing. So, for example, even on Musk's X, community notes is an effective intervention. There's high quality research showing that.
And what are community notes?
Community notes is the notes that gets started and then eventually added to posts that are enough of the users determine that it is false or fake or whatever other labels can get you there. Now, it's, we're talking about a mitigation strategy against a grave threat. I mean, we're maybe chipping away at that, but there are research studies showing that those then tend to get less attention, shares, and retweets and so on. And that, if you expose people to that label, it will undermine belief in that claim. But that maybe that it's too late, but there's some space for continued strategies, even on the leading platforms that have stripped away a lot of what they did before. I think they tend to be more amenable to things they feel are information additive. So maybe using the journalistic quality labels could gain some traction, but I had thought about labels that could be put on frontline civilians and activists in war, because that could be an additive label. And even pre-Musk on X, they had some experimentation with this where you could have lists you could follow, I think, for on-the-ground sources in Ukraine, like around 2022 on X, so Twitter at the time. I do think people should push for these things. One of the other few areas that X and Facebook still take reasonable corrective action against are what they call foreign coordinated influence campaigns. So they won't police misinformation anymore. They don't label it. They don't have fact checkers automated through Facebook, but they will take down some large-scale foreign information campaigns. We have a researcher here at CMIST who works with them and works with their data. It's on teams of researchers who do that. So there are still certain areas, and there may be room to pitch other things that can help hold the line. But there's politics, and Europe is doing more. And, we just have to work within the realistic constraints that exist.
Yeah, in fact, disinformation campaigns are more valuable for the platforms. I mean, they receive more money with this kind of campaigns. So what we could do is to make them paying for these disinformation campaigns more than what they receive.
Right. I mean, the users and advertisers are one of the big pressure points. There are watchdog organizations. Some of them have now, though, they face a huge headwind. I mean, there's a group called Media Matters that is a progressive leading organization trying to expose hate speech and other things. And they were active on X and helped to spur some advertisers leaving, but they are sued aggressively. And it looks like X has basically winning that lawsuit, Elon Musk with his high-powered legal team. And and certainly other countries that are acting in Europe and elsewhere face a tremendous threats to doing this. But that doesn't mean there are no pressure points or possibilities.
Thank you. So we will do our best to include links to those resources that both of you mentioned, the apps you mentioned, Dan, earlier, and also, Jean, the certification process that you said RSF has been working on. Those are all really great ideas, right? To look all the way from the individual to the larger environment, because obviously propaganda is not limited to one country at a time. We have plenty of that to go around. So thank you both for joining me and for contributing to this discussion about propaganda.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
One of my big takeaways from this conversation was that there are many uses of propaganda and mis and disinformation. Changing narratives, preventing good information from reaching people, and just stoking confusion. But there's a lot we can do, including leaning on resources like BBC Verify, Bellingcat, and the Journalism Trust Initiative. We also need to hold governments and corporations accountable for the ways that they allow and even promote false information. It's not easy, but we can make an impact with good old-fashioned political engagement. Thanks for listening to Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Daniel Silverman's work and the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology at cmu.edu/CMIST. You can find out more about Jean Cavalier's work and Reporters Without Borders at rsf.org. We'll include those links, as well as a list of the resources that Dan and Jean mentioned in our show notes. Next week on Disrupting Peace, we're exploring how we can counter violent extremism and ideology.
In many ways, the belief systems, they're a filter through which people see something, a filter and a focus. Information that does not fit with that may be discarded, and information that does might be held. And it is also an oversimplification to say that everyone who's engaging with these beliefs is that fully committed to the belief and unable to receive contradictory information.
Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. Find out more at worldpeacefoundation.org. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at WorldPeaceFDTN. This show is produced by myself and Emily Shaw, engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson, marketing and social media by Kaylin Song, show artwork by Simon Fung. This season was partially funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Special thanks to my colleagues, Lisa Avery and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio. Okay, until next time, stay skeptical and hopeful.